it feels weak to say you're lonely.
Right.
It feels like, that's kind of childish to say you're lonely. Like, that sounds weak, but it's not. We are made for companionship.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to our Friday Roundtable. Joining me today are senior commentator Russell Moore. Hi, Russell.
Hello, Clarissa.
And author and professor at Oklahoma Baptist University, Alan Noble. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
On Wednesday, Tyler Robinson, the suspected murderer of Charlie Kirk, attended his first hearing in Utah in a case that has the death penalty being considered as a possible outcome. There's been a lot of speculation over the last 10 days about the murderer's motive, but one thing is very clear. Tyler Robinson had a robust online life that brought him to darker places on the internet. The New York Times reported that neighbors described Robinson and his roommate saying the couple spent much of their time cloistered inside playing video games. Much of their friend group was online, according to the New York Times, based in the Discord messaging platform that's popular with gamers. Now, we want to be clear that the National Institutes of Health and the American Psychological Association both assert that there is no scientifically established causal link between playing violent video games and real-world acts of violence. However, research is a little more complicated when it comes to the relationship between gaming and loneliness. Meme researcher Aidan Walker has said that the inscriptions on the bullet casings used in Kirk's murder refer to gaming language indicating despair and loneliness. And as we continue to process the death of Charlie Kirk, we wanted to talk about how online life shapes real-world relationships. Alan, part of why I'm glad we're still talking about Kirk's death a week later is that there's so much to process here, so many vectors. And as we think through the implications of his death, we want to avoid that reductionistic thinking that I think we're all seeing in headlines across the internet. Because for every crime that's committed, there are a constellation of factors that contribute. And in your days as a professor surrounded by college students, I'm curious about how you see loneliness manifesting on campus these days.
Yeah. So I think you're exactly right. There's this desire to reduce things to get a simplistic answer about what the causes are, but it's important to look at what the bigger picture is. And loneliness is a big question, and I've seen it affect lots of students in lots of ways. When college students, when high school students enter college, it's a huge shift. They're moving away from home, their base, and many of them don't know where to connect or how to connect, and it can become a period of major loneliness. And in the past, I think students were forced to either return home or make those physical connections, with people. But now there's these opportunities with social media and even, these more, I don't want to say, maybe I want to say darker, places on the internet to turn to find these parasocial connections with people. And so, students will turn to scrolling endlessly, doom scrolling, or they'll find, social media relationships to kind of fill that void. And it can become a very lonely place to be. Even though you're surrounded by these digital friends and you're surrounded by people, you can feel very lonely. And so one of the things that we try to do is try to reach out to students and make sure that they feel at home. And that's a big initiative.
Russell, when you're in a classroom setting, can you tell when a particular student is lonely? Like, are there certain markers that are identifying that for you?
No, and it's tempting, I think, for me to think that that those would be the case. So I think we all know ourselves from the inside out, and so I think a lot of times what we're looking at is, does someone display the marks that I would display if I were lonely right now? And so sometimes you can meet people who seem to be very exuberant and happy and connected, who only when you talk to them later you find out they're very, very deeply lonely. And you'll find other people who are much more introverted, much less seem to be much less connected, but actually do have real connections. And I think that's one of the problems when it comes to addressing loneliness, whether a church or a school or a family or anyone else, is to assume, well, where we're trying to get that person to is to the same kind of experience of community that we think they should have. And that actually a lot of times can drive people further into loneliness or can just mask it. And I think the other part of this that I think is important to know is, and I find myself doing this too, is I think a lot of us tend to think of this as a generational problem that is specific to Gen Z or so forth. But actually, you look around in my experience, maybe even much worse the older the person gets. As a matter of fact, when I think of a lot of people that I worry about in my life, a lot of them are in that period between sort of the end of the peak of their careers and assisted living. A lot of the people who are in assisted living, they have connections because they're there, but it's before that things can get really, really dark. And we don't tend to see that because those people, they typically aren't gaming, but they are doom scrolling, and a lot of times they're numbing themselves with substances. So it's a problem that just transcends all the typical categories, I think, that we tend to look at or want to look at.
I think that's really helpful to expand the aperture here, because it may be a different online platform. Maybe it's not Discord, maybe it's Facebook, but folks are still going to these platforms to enhance their well-being in some way. And how do you convince them that it is detracting from their well-being? Is there a way to do that when we know that so much of online life is actually a diagnosable addiction?
I don't think that we have to convince them that this is detrimental, because I think in almost every case they already know. It's a question of, well, what then? What then do I do? And so it's almost like anyone else who is in a situation. I mean, I can think of situations in my own life where I would say, I know this isn't good, and I know this isn't the best thing, but I don't know what. So it's almost a Romans 7, what I want to do, I don't do, and what I don't want to do, I do, and who will deliver me from this? I think that's really there. It's much less a situation of, say, trying to convince people in the 1960s that they shouldn't smoke. And it's much more like trying to convince people in 2025 that they shouldn't smoke. It's a very different sort of phenomenon. And I think the question is then alternatives, and also for people who will say, I know that is a healthier way to live, but I don't know how I could do that. I don't know how that would be an option for me. And that's a much harder question to answer.
Ellen, it sounds almost like a chicken and an egg problem. Is it loneliness that drives me online, or is it being online that makes me lonely?
Right. Yeah. And there are these temptations that pull, especially when I'm working with younger people who have been raised right in these digital platforms. There's this temptation to self-soothe by going online, right, when they're in socially awkward situations. And so they turn to those things, and instead of turning and facing, like Russell was talking about, and moving forward toward relationships and doing those hard things and being with people, which is what we need in order to be in relationship and avoid loneliness, right? And instead, you turn towards these devices, and now, honestly, for some subset of people, we have AI chatbots as a way of turning toward relationships. And we don't, I haven't found reliable statistics on the percentage of people who are turning to those for relationship substitutes. But there is some subset of people that are doing that are opting out, that are saying, I can't find relationships in the real world, romantic or platonic relationships, friendships, and I need those. I feel that need, and it's too hard. And so I'm turning to that. And because they were digital natives, I think, to answer your question, the chicken or the egg, well, they were raised in this environment. It feels natural. They were born texting, it feels like. So it's like, I'm just going to keep texting to do this. And so part of the challenge, I think, is not only for the person to learn, I have to have the discipline to break out and engage with people, but I think it's also for the church to learn to turn their gaze of attention to those people, right? Eyeballs are so important. Inviting people out for coffee and giving eye-to-eye contact with people is so important. Our attention is so valuable in building relationships of love.
And that's hard, isn't it? Because I think one of the things that I see happen is a lot of times when a church wants to address that issue, they can create these structures of community that are so weird and awkward for people who are not naturally geared toward those kinds of things, that it actually can drive them away.
Yeah.
And you when you're trying to help, you're actually furthering the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. That creates a challenge. So for me, one of the things I try to do as a professor is I try to, Russell, you mentioned it's hard to identify those students. Sometimes it's hard for me. Sometimes I can pick up on students who are clearly, there's something amiss. And, so I reach out in office hours, because I work at a school that's small enough class sizes, I can use office hours to sort of pull that aside and make those connections.
I think of the memes that I've seen that decode these messages that were found on the bullet casings at Charlie Kirk's death, and they're all really sad. They're expressions of people who seem deeply unhappy. And we have these extensive online life evidences in this story, but not everyone who has an extensive online life goes to the place of murdering someone. So talk to me about the pathway from loneliness to a deep alienation that acts out in such a way. Is it a slippery slope? Are there stops along the way to sort of off-ramp someone from that pathway?
I think the issue in this case is actually not the loneliness, but the kind of community. And so if you look at the studies, one of the things that we think that we're going to find are lone wolves, and we do, in the sense that these are people who are lonely and alienated and so forth. But that's not enough to have this kind of radicalization. It means the finding of a substitute kind of community, which is what you see here. And one of the things that we're up against is the fact that if you think about, a lot of people are quoting right now, and I think rightly so, Amanda Ripley talking about conflict entrepreneurs, people for whom it's in their interest to keep people in a state of rage and anger. Well, I think there are also sadness entrepreneurs as well, for whom it's in a business interest to keep people sad and lonely and disconnected. And so you can find a kind of almost substitute community that is destroying community from the inside, because the message that comes to you is, it's never going to be better. This is always going to be the way that it is. And that's one of the things that we really have to reckon with right now. And that also means when Alan brings up the AI chatbots issue, I'm really conflicted about this, because I know that this is not at all a substitute for human community, and I don't want people trying to find that there. On the other hand, I also don't know how to suddenly take that away from somebody who in many cases actually is they're expressing themselves, and what I don't know what the midpoint is to get them from that to health. That's hard to do, especially when somebody doesn't see or recognize that there's a problem, or more importantly, they don't perceive that there's a solution.
Yeah, Alan, the latest iteration of ChatGPT was immediately received with a lot of consternation from folks who were attached to the former iteration because it was more supportive. It was, we would call it sycophantic, but people perceived it to be caring about them.
Yeah. This is the problem, is that people are forming attachments and they're forming bonds with AI. We're creating things and we're not sure what we're creating and what the repercussions are going to be. And we're creating it while we're having a loneliness epidemic, according to our Surgeon General, right? So this is not good timing. This is really not good timing. And it's having serious mental health consequences. And, there have been a number of lawsuits about suicides, tragic suicides that I've read about in the newspapers. And, to Russell's point about, the midway point, that's a great, it's like there's an intervention that needs to happen on a sort of global scale, because you're right. And this gets to, I've read the Surgeon General's reports on the loneliness epidemic, and his conclusion is that it requires social intervention, like community intervention, right? And he says basically the government can do certain things, but communities have to step in, and he's right? It actually takes communities stepping in and getting involved in young people's lives and saying, come outside, let's go for coffee, let's do things, let me look at you in the eyes and ask you, how are you doing today? How was your day at school? These sorts of things to sort of provide an alternative for these chatbots. And unless people are willing to do that, I don't think that sort of just cutting off these chatbots is a viable alternative, but certainly warning about them is a good first step.
It reminds me a little bit of 25 years ago or so. I was in the former Soviet Union reading a English language newspaper talking about the problems that were happening with factory production, because you had people who had been in a Soviet communistic system in which everything was sort of provided. Here's your grocery list for the year. When that suddenly stopped, people started buying vodka, simply using their entire grocery money for that. And so this person is saying we can't function because these people are showing up to work drunk. And then he said, and I don't really have any room to talk because I'm kind of drunk now. And I laughed at first when I saw that, and then but the more I've thought about it, the more I think, that's kind of the situation we're in right now. Is where are the people who are free from this societal problem to the degree that I have my mask on, I can my oxygen mask on, I can help the next person, when we all seem to be going through this, and it's just a matter of degree. That's the real crisis here and the real problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alan, do you think we're unable to help younger people with their loneliness because we're already down in the loneliness pit too?
I think Russell's right to a matter of degrees. I think, you mentioned earlier that older people suffer from this to a different degree. I've certainly found that the older I get, and I tell my students this, the older you get, the harder it is to make friends. And I warn them about this, as much as they're struggling with loneliness as young people, the reality is it's never going to be easier to make friends than when you're in college. That's the reality. Once you get in midlife and older, it gets harder, and people get busy and things drift apart. And a lot of people that I know who are in midlife just have no close friends. And that's the norm. And then when a crisis hits, they start spiraling because they have no support system, and that's not abnormal. So I do think that is a problem that we need to address.
And I think also, and I think this is key for churches, to remove I think there's a sense of stigma around loneliness, where to confess that I'm lonely or to confess that I'm disconnected sounds like I'm confessing that there's something fundamentally wrong with me, which is not the case. And so and what that creates are a group of people who are all pretending like they're not lonely, which means that it seems cheesy to try to actually make connections. And if we could get to the point where we could realize, look, this is not that there's anything wrong with you. It's that you're living in a broken time. And this is hard for everybody. Just some people are easier to pretend like it's not hard.
Yeah.
That would get us a long way toward trying to address this.
Yeah. And there's even something like, it feels weak to say you're lonely.
Right.
It feels like, that's kind of childish to say you're lonely. Like, that sounds weak, but it's not. We are made for companionship, and I think it's also important, that even if you're married, you can still be lonely. Like there's a need for friendship too. Even if you're married, there's still a need for friendship. There's, whether you're single, whether you're married, you still need friendship. It doesn't matter your marital status. You still need friends, and I think that's an important thing to remember.
It's kind of like there was a pastor who would lead groups of people who were holding each other accountable, and said it's really easy for somebody to say, I'm really struggling with lust. And it's even easy for people to say, I'm really struggling with anger. But nobody says I'm really struggling with envy. Because if I say I'm struggling with envy, what I'm doing is not just confessing a sin or a temptation. I'm saying something's really just weird and weak about me in a way that doesn't enable us to actually get at the problem. I think that is really close to what we're facing here with this.
Yeah.
Well, technology is certainly not going away, and we're going to have to figure out how to navigate this loneliness problem in the midst of a world with televisions and smartphones and lots of screens. And Russell, you had a recent conversation with Jonathan Haidt about grandparents and their grandchildren, and listeners, we'll link to that in our show notes because it was a really great one. What insights did you learn from that conversation that might be able to be brought to bear here?
Well, we had a question from a listener who said, what do I do with the fact that I'm taking, when I take my child over to their grandparents' house, they don't have the same boundaries with screens that we do, and so the child is getting absorbed in this. I didn't know how John would respond to it, but my response was kind of, I think it's great that you've got grandparents who are involved in the life of your child, and even if they're not doing things the way you would do them, that's a win. And his response was almost exactly the same thing, which is to say, look, it would be ideal to have a situation where grandparents and you were all on the same page on screens, but if you have to choose between having grandparents involved and not. This is the one to choose, and then also to talk through about how to say, look, rather than shaming the grandparents by saying you're doing something terrible to my child, which those grandparents don't obviously are not trying to do, to say, can you help me with what we're doing here? This is a way to help me, and almost everybody tends to respond to that in a fruitful way. It just means having that conversation.
Because the grandparents and the kids are both on screens.
Yeah. Right.
Well, that makes me think, Alan, of Psalm 68, that he places the lonely in families. And I wonder what that means for us today when we think about placing the lonely in families. Do we need to expand our vision of what family looks like to accommodate for the loneliness epidemic?
I think we do. Because not everybody has a great family. I mean, this is one of the things that, with working with different people, mentoring different people and different students in my life, in my 20 years of teaching, I've learned that, some people have great families and they're ready for them and they build these wonderful relationships and they help with this loneliness. And some people, they've not been given that. And so part of what I think the church has to do is be that family to those people and invite them over for meals and be those kinds of mentors and encouragements and father figures and mother figures for them. And it's important to play that active role and to be that active role. And maybe, as I think Russell and I have been talking about, maybe that begins by taking the log out of our own eye and starting by taking the initiative and saying, what steps do I need to take to make sure that I have these relationships, these intimate relationships with peers that help me, so that I am able to help others. I think that's important too.
Listeners, we know you're still processing the news of last week, and we encourage you to take breaks as you digest what you're reading and hearing. As Mike Cosper often says, go out and smell grass, take a walk and pray, meet up with a friend to memorize some scripture together and grab a hug, and commit to investing more deeply in your real life, flesh and blood community. All of these things provide grounding and hope and an antidote to loneliness in a world where the headlines often will propel us toward despair. Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.